Nothing in your life is actually repeating, but it feels like it is. The same situations show up in different forms. The same patterns return with different faces. Conversations feel familiar, outcomes feel predictable, and no matter how much you try to change things, something underneath keeps pulling everything back into the same structure. And after a while, it starts to feel like you're stuck inside a loop you can't break, like reality itself has decided to stay the same no matter what you do. But that's not what's happening. What's repeating is not your reality. It's the way you're observing it. This is where most people misunderstand the problem. They try to change what's happening externally. They adjust their actions, their environment, their routines, their decisions. They try to think more positively, feel differently, force new behaviors, and create new outcomes through effort. And sometimes that works for a moment. Something shifts slightly, things seem to move, but then, almost without warning, everything falls back into the same pattern again. Not because reality is fixed, but because the observer never changed. The observer is not just your awareness. It is the position from which you interpret everything. It is the lens that determines what you notice, how you react, what you expect, and ultimately, what you reinforce. And that lens is not neutral. It is built from memory, from identity, from patterns that have been repeated so many times that they feel automatic. So even when something new happens, you don't experience it as new. You interpret it through what you already know. From a neuroscience perspective, your brain is constantly filtering reality based on previous patterns. It predicts what will happen, it selects what to focus on, and it fills in the gaps using past experiences. That means you are not seeing reality as it is. You are seeing a version of reality that has already been shaped before the moment even begins. And that shaping happens instantly. From a quantum perspective, this becomes even more precise. The observer effect shows that the act of observation influences the outcome itself, not in a vague or mystical way, but in a very direct sense. The state of the observer determines how potential collapses into form, which means the way you observe is not passive. It is participatory. You are not watching reality. You are shaping it in real time. This is why things feel like they repeat, because even when life presents something different, you are still observing it from the same identity, the same expectations, the same emotional baseline. You recognize what is familiar. You react in ways that are consistent with who you have been, and without realizing it, you reinforce the same version of reality again, not intentionally, not consciously, but consistently. This is why effort alone doesn't break the loop. You can try to act differently, but if your observation hasn't changed, your interpretation will pull everything back into alignment with what you already believe is true. You might say different words, take different actions, make different decisions, but underneath all of that, the same observer is still filtering everything the same way. And that is what keeps reality stable. Not your circumstances, not your actions, but your consistency as the observer. This is where the real question begins to shift. It's no longer about what you need to do differently or how you can change your life externally. It becomes something much more precise than that. It becomes about where you are observing from and whether that position has actually changed. Because if it hasn't, then nothing else truly will. And once you start to see this clearly, something begins to break. Not the pattern itself, but your certainty about it. You begin to realize that what felt like being stuck was actually something else entirely. Something more subtle, more consistent, and far more powerful than external circumstances. You were never stuck inside reality. You were stabilizing it by watching it the same way. Most people hear about the observer effect and immediately translate it into something simplistic. They think it means, think positive and your reality will change, or focus on what you want and it will appear. But that interpretation is incomplete. And because of that, it keeps people stuck in the exact loop they're trying to escape. Because the observer effect is not about what you think for a moment, it's about what you consistently are. In quantum mechanics, the observer effect refers to the fact that the act of observation influences the state of a system. But this influence is not random. And it is not based on isolated thoughts. It is based on the condition of the observer itself. The system responds to the state from which it is being observed, not just the intention behind it. And that changes everything when you apply it to your life. Because you are not observing reality from a neutral position. You are observing from identity. That means every time you look at your life, every time you interpret a situation, every time you assign meaning to something that happens, you are doing it from a pre-existing state. That state includes your beliefs, your emotional patterns, your expectations, and your past experiences. It is not something you turn on and off. It is something that is continuously active in the background. So even when you try to think differently, even when you attempt to change your focus, if the underlying state hasn't shifted, your observation remains the same at its core. This is why people feel like they are doing everything right, but nothing changes. They are applying techniques on the surface while the observer underneath remains unchanged. They are trying to modify outcomes without altering the position from which those outcomes are being perceived. And the field responds to that position. From a neurological perspective, this is deeply connected to how perception works. Your brain does not passively receive information. It predicts, filters, and constructs your experience based on what it already knows. It selects what is relevant, ignores what doesn't fit, and organizes everything into patterns that feel consistent with your identity. That means your reality is not just what happens. It is what you are able to perceive and interpret. And that perception is not objective. It is conditioned. From a quantum perspective, this conditioning becomes a form of repeated observation. You are collapsing the same possibilities over and over again because you are observing from the same state. Even when different possibilities exist, your observation filters them out, ignores them, or reshapes them into something familiar. So instead of experiencing new outcomes, you keep reinforcing existing ones. This is where the illusion of being stuck is created, not because reality has no other options, but because you are consistently selecting the same one. And the most important part is that this selection does not feel like a choice. It feels automatic. It feels like this is just how things are. It feels like you are simply reacting to reality, when in fact, you are participating in its stabilization. Every interpretation you make strengthens a certain version of reality. Every expectation you hold directs your attention in a specific way. Every emotional reaction reinforces a pattern that becomes easier to access the next time. And over time, this creates a closed loop. You observe from the same state. You perceive the same patterns. You react in the same way. You confirm the same reality. And then you believe that reality is repeating. But what is actually repeating is the observer. This is why breaking the loop does not begin with changing your circumstances. It does not begin with forcing new outcomes or trying to control external variables. It begins with something much more fundamental than that. It begins with shifting the position from which you are observing everything, because the moment that position changes, the way reality organizes around you cannot stay the same. Once you begin to understand that your observation is not neutral, a different question starts to emerge naturally. If your reality keeps showing the same patterns, the same outcomes, the same emotional cycles, then what exactly is being repeated? Because at some level you already know that life is not static. Things change, people change, circumstances evolve. And yet, the core experience remains familiar in a way that feels almost impossible to escape. That familiarity is not coming from reality itself. It is coming from you. More specifically, it is coming from the identity that is observing everything. Because identity is not just how you describe yourself. It is the structure that determines how you interpret everything that happens. It defines what you notice, what you ignore, what feels important, what feels threatening, what feels possible, and what feels out of reach. It is not something abstract. It is active in every moment, shaping your perception before you even realize it. So when your identity remains the same, your interpretation remains the same. And when your interpretation remains the same, your experience follows that pattern. This is why reality starts to feel predictable, not because nothing new is happening, but because you are consistently extracting the same meaning from what happens. two people can go through the exact same situation and experience it in completely different ways, because they are observing from different identities. What feels like opportunity to one person feels like limitation to another. What feels like progress to one feels like failure to another. The difference is not the situation, it is the observer. From a neurological perspective, this is reinforced through pattern recognition. Your brain is constantly scanning for what it already knows, because familiarity is efficient. It reduces uncertainty, saves energy, and creates a sense of control. So it prioritizes information that matches your existing identity and filters out anything that doesn't. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where you keep seeing evidence that confirms who you believe you are. And that evidence feels real, but it is selected. From a quantum perspective, this selection becomes even more powerful. You're not just noticing patterns. You are reinforcing them through observation. The more you observe something from the same state, the more stable that version of reality becomes. It is not that other possibilities don't exist. It is that they are not being collapsed into your experience, because you are not observing from a state that allows them. This is why change feels so difficult, not because it requires more effort, but because it requires a shift in identity before it can be perceived. You cannot experience a fundamentally different reality while observing from the same internal position. Even if something new appears, you will reinterpret it, minimize it, or reshape it until it fits what is already familiar. And that is how repetition is created, not through circumstance, but through consistency of identity. This is also why people feel like they are making progress, but nothing truly changes. They learn new concepts, they become more aware, they even start thinking differently in certain moments. But when it comes to how they interpret their life as a whole, the same identity is still active. And that identity continues to organize everything into the same structure. So even growth gets absorbed into the same pattern. It becomes an upgraded version of the same loop. This is the part that most people don't see. They think repetition means nothing is changing, but in reality things are changing all the time. What is not changing is the observer that defines what those changes mean. And as long as that observer remains the same, every change will be interpreted in a way that reinforces the existing identity. You don't see reality as it is, you see reality as you are. And until that changes, repetition is inevitable. Because you are not just experiencing reality, you are continuously confirming it. And once you begin to see that clearly, the loop becomes visible in a way that cannot be ignored anymore. Not as something external, but as something that is happening through your own perception, moment by moment, without needing conscious effort. And that realization leads to something even deeper. Because if your observation is creating the loop, then there must be a way to see where it happens in real time. The most powerful part of this entire process is not the concept itself. It's the moment you start seeing it happening in real time, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. What felt like randomness begins to reveal a structure, and what felt like being stuck begins to show a pattern that is repeating with precision. But the reason most people don't notice this loop is because it doesn't look like a loop. It looks like daily life. You wake up, and before anything even happens externally, your mind already starts interpreting. It brings familiar thoughts, familiar expectations, subtle assumptions about how the day will go, how people will respond, how situations will unfold. None of this feels intentional. It feels automatic, almost invisible, like a background process you don't question. Then something happens. A conversation, a message, a situation, a small event, and instantly, you interpret it. Not consciously, not slowly, but immediately. You assign meaning to it based on what you already know, based on what you've experienced before, based on the identity that is already active. That meaning triggers a response, emotional or mental, sometimes subtle, sometimes more noticeable. And that response reinforces a certain perception of reality. Then the next moment comes, and the same process repeats. By the end of the day, nothing dramatic needed to happen for the loop to complete itself. You observed, interpreted, reacted, and confirmed a version of reality over and over again. Not in big decisions, but in micro moments that felt insignificant on their own, but powerful in accumulation. And that accumulation is what stabilizes your experience. This is why it feels like you're stuck, because the loop is not visible at the level you are looking. You are looking at outcomes, but the loop is happening in observation. From a neurological perspective, this is the brain running predictive cycles. It anticipates what is likely to happen, filters incoming information through those expectations, and then adjusts your responses to match that prediction. This creates efficiency, but it also creates repetition. You are not just reacting to reality. You are continuously confirming what your brain expects to see. And that expectation becomes your experience. From a quantum perspective, this is the observer collapsing the same pattern repeatedly. You are not just noticing what is happening. You are selecting it through attention, interpretation, and emotional reinforcement. Each moment of observation strengthens a specific version of reality, making it more stable, more consistent, and more likely to repeat. And because this happens continuously, it feels like reality itself is fixed. But it's not. It's being reinforced. This is the part where everything becomes clear. You are not trapped inside your circumstances. You are not limited by what is happening around you. You are participating in a loop that is being maintained through how you observe, interpret, and respond to every moment. And the most important part is this: you are doing it without noticing, because it feels normal. It feels like this is just how things are. But once you begin to see it, even slightly, something shifts. You start catching small moments where your interpretation happens automatically. You notice how quickly you assign meaning, how fast you react internally, how familiar everything feels before you even question it. And in that noticing, a gap begins to appear, a gap between what happens and how you observe it. That gap is where the loop can break, not through force, not through control, but through awareness. If you can see the loop, you are no longer fully inside it. Comment: I see the loop. Because the moment you recognize that your reality is being reinforced through observation, you stop treating it as something fixed, and you start realizing it's something you've been repeating. Once you begin to see the loop, the instinct is to try to change what is happening. You might feel the urge to act differently, to force new behaviors, to interrupt the pattern at the level of action. But this is where the deeper misunderstanding still exists, because the loop is not sustained by what you do. It is sustained by how you observe what you do. And that changes where the real shift has to happen. Because if you try to change reality without changing the observer, you will only create temporary variations of the same pattern. You might get different outcomes for a moment, you might feel like something is moving, but the underlying structure will remain the same. And eventually, everything reorganizes itself back into what is familiar, because the observer is still the same. The real shift is not behavioral, it is perceptual. You are not trying to act like a different person. You are becoming a different observer. That means the focus is no longer on controlling what happens externally, but on noticing how you are interpreting everything internally. It means recognizing that the moment something happens, your first instinct is to assign meaning based on the past, and that meaning is what directs your response. If that meaning changes, your entire experience of that moment changes, even if the external situation remains the same. From a neurological perspective, this is the interruption of predictive patterns. Instead of allowing the brain to automatically assign familiar interpretations, you begin to create space before that interpretation solidifies. That space is where new neural pathways can begin to form, not through force, but through lack of repetition of the old pattern. From a quantum perspective, this is where the observer shifts position. You are no longer collapsing reality from the same state. You are not reinforcing the same pattern with the same level of coherence. And because of that, the structure that was previously stable begins to lose consistency. Not because you are pushing against it, but because you are no longer feeding it. This is where things start to feel different in a way that is subtle but undeniable. The same situations may still appear, but they no longer carry the same weight. The same triggers may arise, but they don't fully activate the same responses. The same patterns may begin to form, but they don't complete themselves in the same way. And that is the beginning of real change. Because reality does not shift when something new appears. It shifts when something old stops repeating. This is why the observer is everything, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical mechanism that determines what continues and what dissolves. Every time you observe without reinforcing the old meaning, you weaken the loop. Every time you allow a moment to exist without immediately interpreting it through the past, you create space for a different outcome to emerge. And this does not require effort in the way most people think. It does not require constant control, constant awareness, or perfect alignment. It requires something much simpler and much more precise. It requires not completing the same pattern, because the pattern needs your participation to continue. It needs your interpretation, your reaction, your confirmation. Without that, it loses coherence. It begins to break down, not all at once, but gradually, as each moment is no longer reinforcing it. And this is where the shift becomes inevitable. Not because you forced reality to change, but because you stopped observing it in the same way. And once that happens consistently, something becomes very clear. You are not trying to escape the loop anymore. You are no longer inside it in the same way. You are seeing it from a different position, and that position changes everything that follows. Because the moment you become a different observer, the same reality cannot repeat in the same way anymore. If you've made it this far and you can recognize these patterns in your own experience, that's exactly why I created the Awaken Your Quantum Power Guide. It's not about adding more techniques or giving you something else to try. It's about helping you stabilize this new way of observing, so you don't fall back into the same loops that keep repeating your reality. You'll find it in the pinned comment, because at this level the shift is no longer about learning more. It's about observing differently, consistently. At a certain point, something begins to change in a way that doesn't feel dramatic, but feels undeniable. It doesn't come as a breakthrough or a sudden realization. It comes as a quiet shift in how you relate to everything that happens. You are no longer watching your reality with the same intensity, the same assumptions, the same need to confirm what you already believe. There is space where there used to be automatic interpretation, and that space changes the entire structure of your experience. You stop reacting in the same way. You stop assigning the same meanings. You stop completing the same patterns. And that is where everything begins to move. Because the loop was never maintained by reality itself. It was maintained by the continuity of your observation. The repetition was not coming from the outside. It was coming from the consistency of how you were perceiving, interpreting, and reinforcing each moment. And the moment that continuity breaks, even slightly, the entire structure begins to lose stability. From a neurological perspective, this is where the old patterns stop being activated at the same frequency. The brain no longer defaults to the same predictions with the same certainty. It begins to open to different interpretations, different responses, different ways of organizing experience. And as those new pathways begin to activate, even subtly, the old ones start to weaken, not because you forced them to stop, but because they are no longer being used in the same way. From a quantum perspective, this is where the observer becomes truly different. You are no longer collapsing reality from the same state.